Text Talks.
Hello and welcome to
Text Talks.
I'm Katie.
And I'm Alex.
And today, Alex, I believe we're talking about Buddhism and science.
Yes, we are. So before I start this, I want to point out that this podcast is very closely tied with the Buddhism in the West podcast that we released last week. So if you haven't listened to that already, I would suggest going to do that, because I'm going to be referencing lots of parts of that history today when we talk about Buddhism and its relationship to science today. So go check that out.
And don't forget to look at the PowerPoint and worksheets
Yes,
as well.
which are all up on the Google Drive. You can just have a look on our Facebook page or Twitter, and all of the links are there for you to follow. So, what are the aims of today's session? It's to explore the history of dialogues between Buddhism and science, so how Buddhism and science have interacted with one another. And we're going to examine some of the key examples of Buddhism and science coming to similar conclusions. But then we're going to ask whether the relationship between Buddhism and science is a fair one. Is there a power dynamic going on there? And finally, we're going to question to what extent Evan Thompson's idea of Buddhist exceptionalism is true. So I'll explain who Evan Thompson is and what the idea of Buddhist exceptionalism is.
It's a mouthful.
Yeah. But then we're going to have a discussion about whether we think that's true or not. So, let's start with our general perception. Today, I assume you're the same, Katie, we live in a world where we assume that Buddhism and science are pretty compatible with each other.
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of links to Buddhism being a very environmental religion and not having, as strict an idea of a deity. So yeah, it seems fairly compatible.
Yeah, and a lot of people are of that opinion too. And so what we're going to do in this podcast is kind of question how that understanding came about. So to start off with, and you'll have heard this probably countless times if you've tuned into every podcast we've talked about, I'm going to start with the World Parliament of Religions in 1893 in Chicago. So if you have heard about this, you can skip forward about 2 minutes. But the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago, it was about the East and the West meeting for a big interfaith dialogue, discussing all aspects of religion, but in particular, how religion and science can match together. And the reason this kind of came about was because some scholars have argued that in 1893, the West was going through what was called the Victorian crisis of faith. And this is where scientific discoveries were undermining the Christian notion of a God. And so scientists and scholars alike were looking outside of Western traditions to try and find something a tradition that might be compatible with the science that they were discovering. And so they looked to the East for answers. And that's because there was a general conception that the East was more spiritual. Now, if you've also listened to our Hinduism in the West podcast, you'll hear me talk about this exact event and the problem of Orientalism here. And this is the idea that these scholars were breaking down this world into the East being spiritual and the West being rational. And the East as a spiritual place could come and fix the problems of the West. Now, this is difficult because that's pigeonholing the East, which is an entire set of countries, cultures, etc., and saying that everything that comes out of there is more spiritual than the West. But similarly, it's undermining them and saying that any culture from the East isn't rational. It needs the West's help too. So there is a problem here. But in the World Parliament of Religions, the way the scholars tried to address this was to invite speakers from the East, particularly Swami Vivekananda from India, Soyen Shaku from Japan, and Angrika Dharmapala from Sri Lanka, to come over to America and discuss their traditions. Now, what they did here, though, these three thinkers in particular, is that they they realised why they were being invited. And so they decided to portray their traditions in a way that didn't conflict with modern science. You know, you think about Buddhism and everything that we've talked about over the last, few weeks, and how diverse Buddhism is. And they got to stand up on stage and try and sell Buddhism to the Western world. So what they did is they picked the bits of Buddhism that would fit with what their audience was wanting to hear. And so that's created this perception of Buddhism that didn't conflict with science, because the way that Angrika Dharmapala and Soyen Shaku talked about it, they deliberately used scientific terms. They deliberately omitted a lot of the mystical aspects, particularly Soyen Shaku coming from a Japanese tradition. That's part of the great vehicle, a part of Mahayana, and we know that other aspects of Mahayana Buddhism, there's massive amounts of imagery, there's gods, there's deities. None of that was presented there. Buddhism was deliberately packaged to fit scientific thought, because...
Well, when you're selling something, you phrase it in a way that the audience is going to be interested in.
Yeah, and because of the Victorian crisis of faith, it was very obvious why these people had been invited over to America. It wasn't just to open the world to Buddhism. It was
create a genderless dialogue between everyone.
Yeah, there was a complete agenda, which was, can these people save our spirits? And so the way that it came across is that Buddhism was a scientific tradition. And like I say, you can hear more about me. I discuss more about this in the Buddhism in the West podcast, and specific characters and how they actually did this. But this left us with the character or the person of D.T. Suzuki. Now, Suzuki was very prominent in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and he was a Zen monk and student of Soyen Shaku, and he was instrumental in linking parts of Buddhism with science. But I'm not going to go into that too much here, because I've already covered a lot of that in the previous podcast. So today, what the legacy of this of the World Parliament of Religions is that Buddhism and science are seen as synonymous with one another, and that's been propagated by other Buddhist figures. So, for example, probably the most famous example is the Mind and Life conferences, which have been run since 1983, and that's actually spearheaded by the 14th Dalai Lama. And at these conferences, it's got experts from different scientific communities, it's got practicing Buddhist monks, and they have discussions about cognitive science, about quantum theory, and how Buddhism kind of already had these kind of ideas thousands of years ago. And some of the comparisons that are made at this conference are between Buddhist concepts of mind and cognitive sciences today, so psychology, psychotherapy, all of these aspects. And so we've got things like the 5 skandhas. So in Buddhism, the breaking down of the consciousness into 5 different parts. Ultimately, this is to argue for not self, anatta, because there is no one thing that constructs mind. And then you've got the Yogacara school, which is known as the mind-only school. So there is a lot of similarities here between how rationalistic scientific thought today is trying to dissect what the mind is, and ancient Buddhist traditions. So they have a lot to talk about, and there's a lot of comparison. It's like, well, yeah, this theory in science is very similar to this theory that Buddhists had 500 years ago or 1,500 years ago. And, one of the key things that has been brought out by this engagement between Buddhism and cognitive sciences is this idea of neuroplasticity. Now,
okay, that's a big word.
Yeah. So neuroplasticity is this idea that our minds physically can be altered by the thoughts that we have.
Right.
Katie's looking at me quite blankly here. So
mine's being altered by my lack of thought here.
you've achieved nirvana. So neuroplasticity, they have done experiments here where they've taken Buddhist monks and watched them meditate. They've probed their brains, and so they can see the brain functions going on. And the part of the brain that gives us our sense of self, they noticed in the monks at least in this study, was smaller than the average human. And so they've done other experiments where they've seen whether over time this part of the brain shrinks with meditation. And do you know what they found? That it does. The part of the brain associated with self, if we are meditating properly, literally shrinks.
Wow. Okay, so what does that mean?
Well, Buddhism is all about the not self principle. It's about anatta. So through meditative practice, trying to understand and grapple with this notion of not self, our minds physically alter, and the part of the brain that deals with self shrinks.
Wow.
At least in these studies, you could probably find studies where this hasn't happened, but there have been those cases out there where through meditation there has been real physical evidence provided that your brain alters, not just brain function, literally brain physicality. And so this gives people at the Mind and Life conference a lot to talk about. The other area in which Buddhism and science are often put in dialogue with each other is in quantum physics. Now, I'm no expert on quantum physics, so I'm not going to try and explain everything about it here. But there are a lot of similarities between, and there's a lot of papers out there and books about similarities between quantum physics and this idea of sunyata, which is emptiness. So the idea that nothing holds its own existence. Everything is in tension with each other. And also with Nagarjuna's two truths theory, which is the idea that we live in this conventional world, but actually there's a real world beyond it, and that real world, everything is empty, everything is sunyata. But we can't go around saying, well, you're empty and this ice cream's empty, because otherwise it would cause chaos. So we have to create the conventional world layered on top of the real empty world. And there's a lot of similarities been brought to people's attention by scholars about quantum physics and how it and sunyata link together. So one really good example of this is the double slit experiment, which I don't know if it's still the case, but I did in secondary school in physics. And this is where if you shine a laser through these two slits, they behave like particles, as we would expect, because I'm watching them. What's really interesting about the double slit experiment is that when this is conducted without someone there observing it, the particles in the laser go through the double slits and form, or appear to show that they have formed waves. So the physical act of an observer alters the laser's physical properties.
Wow.
And so this ties in with everything that Buddhism has been saying, that the mind has an impact on the universe. An observer literally solidifies this laser into a particle. When it's not there, it could be a particle or a wave. This is Schrodinger's cat. It's in the safe. Is it alive or dead? Well, we only know if we observe it. And so that's the double slit experiment demonstrates this. And so it's actually a conscious mind. It's someone observing this phenomena that solidifies the laser to be what it is. So there's a lot there for, Buddhists and scientists to discuss, because they've, again, like we've just said, they've got so many theories of mind from both aspects. And it shows that everything in the world seems to be interconnected. And, we've talked a lot about interconnectedness in Buddhism in the Buddhism and Environment podcast. But to just go back over it, there's a really great metaphor for this in Buddhism to show that everything in the world, or reality itself, let's talk in quantum levels, literally reality, everything is connected through this metaphor of Indra's net. And this is the idea that, imagine the universe is an infinite net, and at every intersection of the net, there's a jewel. And so each of these jewels reflects into every other jewel across the net. And similarly, every other jewel reflects into this one jewel that we're looking at. So if we were to alter anything about that jewel, the whole net would change. And that's kind of the findings that we're seeing in quantum physics. It's that, something can happen in one place, and does that have a knock-on effect universally somewhere else? This is, again, I'm not going to go too much into it, but this is kind of the premise of string theory, is that if you do something to one atom on one part of the Earth, does that have an implication, a direct implication on another atom somewhere else? And there have been scientific studies that have demonstrated, well, yes, there is. And so this was really, brought to light. This dialogue between Buddhism and science, especially using Indra's net, was brought to light in 1976 in a book called The Tao of Physics. Now, this was written by Fritjof Capra, who was a physicist and keen Buddhist/Taoist. And what he does here is he takes scientific experiments of the day, of the 70s, and discusses them in terms of Buddhism, in terms of Taoism, in terms of Hinduism. And what he's trying to do is promote the fact that these ancient traditions had already clocked onto all of this hundreds, if not thousands of years ago. So, we could say that that's great. Buddhism and science having these dialogues, fantastic. But do you think that relationship is healthy? That relationship between Buddhism and science is a healthy one?
I'm not sure, because it seems odd that science is seeking Buddhist ideas.
Yeah, and I think part of that might be this hangover we have from the Victorian faith crisis. There's still kind of, even though people might want rationality, they also want a bit of romanticism. And so going to something different and finding the same answer, that's exciting for a lot of people. But there is a lot of debate as to whether this relationship between Buddhism and science is fair and whether it's equal at all. So let's imagine a scale. At one end, you've got this idea that Buddhism and science are similar. And at the other end, you've got that Buddhism is science. Now today, you have people falling on all the way along that scale. Some people will say Buddhism and science are similar, they can actually fill in the gaps for each other. And other people are like, well, no, Buddhism was an original science. It's a science of mind. It just predated modern science by 2,500 years. But I think what happens, whatever side you're on here, it demonstrates that Buddhism always seems to be conforming to science and not the other way around. Science seems to be the goal, and Buddhism is helping us get there. And that's a power dynamic. That means that in these discussions, often they can be seen as asymmetrical. They're not on a level playing field. It's always people trying to associate Buddhism with science because they have this heightened view of what science is. It's very rare that people have a heightened view of Buddhism and then claim that science gets you towards nirvana, for example. And, this causes or shows a problem with our society more generally, and that's that a lot of times people are susceptible to what's called scientific materialism. And this is where people believe in the power of science so much that science itself becomes a dogma. Science itself becomes like a tradition that is always true, that it's always this. And that causes difficulties when we're trying to have a discussion about if you've got a fundamental member of one tradition and a fundamental member of another tradition and try and get them to have a dialogue, it might not be very successful. What we need is for both sides to be quite open and receptive. But a lot of the time, scientific materialism creeps in, where people prioritize science, and therefore that makes that dialogue quite jolted and quite difficult.
Yeah, because I think if you're on the side of science in a debate, for example, you're going to say, oh yeah, but the science, because science, and that's like enough of an argument. But that's kind of like in a theology saying, oh well, yeah, God exists because of God, which, okay, you know, that's an argument, and a lot of theologies are based around that, but it's not as satisfying and, you know, to prove your point, where, you know, science has proven this because science.
Yeah, it gives you a get out clause sort of thing. It's like, but science is constantly changing too. Like, Buddhism's constantly changing, science is constantly changing. We need to be very clear about those discussions. But I think, yeah, a lot of the discussions that are had today, people fall back on scientific materialism and be like, I don't believe in this because science. And it's like, well, can you be a bit more explicit? Like, you're closing yourself off to a dialogue there. And that particularly happens with religion. But the interesting thing is, I although I've critiqued, you know, Buddhism and its engagement with science a bit here, is that there's still this phenomena today of Buddhist exceptionalism. Now, this is coined by a person called Evan Thompson. And basically, it's this idea that Buddhism today is perceived as being so rational and so empirical that it is more scientific than any other religion, and therefore can have these dialogues, you know, to a greater extent with other religions. Sorry, with science. And, you know, that's left a legacy. This is a legacy of that history of transmission that we talked about earlier. You know, from early on in its, you know, journey, its life in the West, Buddhism has been portrayed as scientific. And so, you know, 100 and something so years later, we still believe that. And so how many times have you heard the phrase, oh, Buddhism's not a religion, it's a way of life?
Oh, all the time, yeah.
And that's Buddhist exceptionalism. That's, you know, okay, the term religion is a Western construct that we need to be careful of using anyway, but the idea of saying that Buddhism is a way of life rather than a religion, especially in a religious studies course, infers that Buddhism is better than other religions in some way. And why is it better? Oh, because it conforms with modern science.
Wow, yeah.
And so we need to be really careful of this Buddhist exceptionalism. Like, I think Buddhism is fantastic, but we as a society often view it as this, like, exception to other religions.
And that validates it somehow in our Western context, being less religious and more like a Western values of science is better. And that's a completely wrong approach to viewing the world. Yeah,
and it's a complete misunderstanding of all of Buddhism. But the reason we've got here is because of narrow views of Buddhism the whole way along. You know, we're sat here talking about Buddhism and science, and yet we have a green Tara on the wall next to us.
Yeah.
And that is you know, how can that be a scientific image? You know, it's a very bright and colourful image.
Of a goddess.
Like, that's not scientific. We've got to realise that the Buddhist tradition is so much bigger than what is often portrayed, and then also realise why people might be choosing to portray it as such and where that has come from. Because often a lot of these things, it's no one individual's fault that this has been the case. This is history. It's just history in action. But been able to trace back that lineage. Okay, well, why is Buddhism seen as exceptional? Oh, and why is it exceptional? Okay, because it conforms with science. Okay, where did Buddhism and science first start interacting with one another? Let's go back to the World Parliament of Religions, and so on. So today I kind of want to leave you with probably more questions than answers. I just want to...
I think most of our podcasts might do that.
Yeah. And so my questions are, to you as a teacher, as a student, and these are things that you can discuss with your class, is, do you think the relationship between Buddhism and science is equal? You know, despite what I've said, everyone is valid to have their own opinions here. And go out and do your research. Go into the papers, have a look at all of these different arguments I've been presenting. How far do you agree with Thompson's idea of Buddhist exceptionalism? Do you think Buddhism is exceptional? If so, why? What about Buddhism makes it an exception to the rule with regards to other religions today? And then my final question is, do you think that Buddhist ideas are inherently scientific, or that the way in which we have had Buddhism portrayed to us just makes it seem that way? So those are my questions.
Well, yeah, definitely. Particularly that last one for me is something that, is going to require a lot of thinking and probably not going to come up with the answer too quickly, but definitely something to think about. Thank you so much. Yeah, so much there. Really, really interesting and really insightful. And thank you for listening. So if you have any questions whatsoever about anything we've covered today, you can get in touch with us on Facebook at Text Talks or on Twitter at Text Talks 1.
Thank you very much.